On one dark and stormy night, a mad scientist at Cornell University, hidden from the prying eyes of both polite society and the law, pieced together a veritable Frankenstein's monster from assorted chicken parts and a never-before-seen batter coating. He called his new creation the Chicken Crispy. But unlike the batter, the crispy name would not stick. When this new creation was finally unveiled to the public, it had an all-new identity, and soon, every man, woman, and child across America would know its name. Today, we're dunking into the sweet and sour history of chicken nuggets. All right, get your McNugget buddies in a row, and don't let them see the dipping sauce. During the Second World War, the U.S. military seized much of America's red meat supply, and citizens at home were made to ration what was left over. While this caused some to buy their beef and pork from black market meatleggers, a name which makes them sound more whimsical than they probably were, many instead turned to the military's unwanted, unrationed meat supply, fresh poultry. Soon, farmers began raising more and more chickens to meet this increased demand, and many began breeding their birds bigger and better than ever before. While in the war's final months, the U.S. military jumped on this growing market, driving chicken sales to their highest levels yet. Victory in Japan brought with it beef's heroic return to the home front. Chicken sales quickly plummeted, and there was an immediate issue of too much supply and too little demand. For the decade and a half that followed, chicken farmers struggled to sell their birds. Whole chickens were too big for individuals to eat on their own, but too small for the sudden baby boom and the big families that came with it. Enter Cornell professor Robert C. Baker. Baker was a poultry fanatic, and he wanted his fellow countrymen to be just as passionate about chicken and turkey as he was. He'd previously worked outside of Ithaca, New York, and he'd seen firsthand how chicken farmers were struggling to get by. Baker knew that if these poultry pushers wanted to survive, they need to make better use of their birds. His solution? Increased processing, allowing more parts of the bird to be used than ever before. The chickens were less excited about this breakthrough. After receiving his doctorate in food sciences from Purdue University in 1956, Baker headed to a basement lab at Cornell, wherein he devised all sorts of new and innovative ways to make use of chicken. Over the course of his career, Baker would be credited with producing nearly 300 research papers and developing over 40 different poultry-related innovations, including the first-ever chicken hot dogs and the ever-popular turkey ham, just like Mom used to make. Still, none of his other creations would reach the cultural ubiquity of his finest invention, the chicken nugget. While singular in its delectable scrumptiousness, the chicken nugget accounted for not just one of Baker's innovations, but three. It all started in 1963, when Baker was joined by his protege, Joseph Marshall, while attempting to solve two separate age-old problems. How can you make ground chicken meat stick together without using the skin? And how do you create a breading for it that's simultaneously freezable and able to be deep-fried? It's harder than it sounds. What they came up with was a grain, vinegar, salt, and milk powder concoction to bind the meat, and an egg and grain-based mixture for the breading. And thus, in April of that year, without bothering to patent his newfound invention, Baker published the world's first-ever chicken nugget recipe under the name of Chicken Crispies in Cornell University's Food Science Bulletin, Agricultural Economics Research. That issue of Agricultural Economics Research, in turn, was mailed out to about 500 different companies around the country, and it wasn't long before all the usual suspects began claiming that it was them who'd invented the original chicken nugget, leaving Baker, for a time, a mere footnote in the extra crispy history of processed chicken. In the 1970s, America began to fear red meat. People were concerned that beef consumption was leading to high rates of heart disease. All the cigarettes that were being sold at the time probably didn't help either, but those are easier to hide around the house than cheeseburgers. So in 1977, Congress released the Dietary Goals of the United States. These goals encouraged citizens to forego red meat and to instead eat leaner proteins, like chicken and fish. While following these guidelines may have led to a healthier population in the past, the rise of processed poultry virtually canceled out any health benefits acquired from making the switch. Science never got in the way of the U.S. government, though, and red meat sales soon fell. Many fast food joints, dependent on burger sales to stay afloat, began to panic. They needed to pivot fast in order to keep things running. To this end, McDonald's led the charge. hiring famed chef René Arend for the job. He's the guy who designed the McRib for them, among other things. René's first ideas were a saucy fried chicken breast and a chicken pot pie, both of which the clown quickly shut down. The company then tried their first shot at the McChicken sandwich, the only menu item at McDonald's nobody wants to eat. But after disappointing sales, they pulled the McChicken from stores entirely. McDonald's Big Cheese, Ray Kroc, apparently feeling defeated after these false starts, asked René to switch gears and to work instead on making a bite-sized onion ring, as if that would save the struggling Golden Arches. Not all of his ideas were great. Just ask the San Diego Padres. Kroc called this idea the onion nugget.
This is an onion ring that has been made easier to consume.
And the history of humanity nearly took an entirely different direction. For a brief period, onion nuggets even got a limited release, being sold at McDonald's locations in the late 70s for 45 cents a serving. But then chairman of McDonald's, Fred Turner, had different plans for us all. According to legend, he was still hell-bent on a chicken idea, and one day he wondered aloud, "Oh, why not a chicken nugget?" He makes an excellent point. Chef René Arend ran straight up to the kitchen, chopped up some chicken, battered it, fried it up, and voila! The Chicken McNugget was born. After over a year of tinkering with the recipe, McDonald's got in contact with Keystone Foods, the food processing company that already provided them with their frozen burgers, and asked that they start providing tiny chunks of processed chicken as well. Then they also contacted Gordon's, famed for their frozen fish sticks, to provide the company with the perfect batter. And thus, in 1981, the same year that René created his infamous McRib, Chicken McNuggets found their place in Knoxville area test markets, and the sales were unlike anything McDonald's had seen before. Mickey D's knew they had a hit on their hands, and that they needed a bigger chicken supplier if they wanted to produce their McNuggets globally. So they hit up Tyson Foods. Tyson, in turn, bred for the task an entirely new kind of chicken. They called this new bird breed Mr. McDonald, and it was identifiable by its ginormous breasts, which were even bigger than the breasts of Tyson's famed Chicken of Tomorrow breed. Once scientifically perfected, these Mr. McDonald chickens were then sent to processing plants all across America and were ground into 4 different nugget shapes: the bone, which is sometimes called the bow tie, the bell, the ball, and the boot, all of which were standardized to ensure consistent cooking times, and all of which are still made to this day. Finally, in 1983, the Chicken McNugget, with its barbecue, hot mustard, and sweet and sour sauces in tow, was ready for its global debut, the shock waves of which would soon upend the fast food industry forever. Within the first few months of the Chicken McNuggets release, McDonald's grew into the second largest chicken retailer in the world, trailing behind only KFC. In fact, the Chicken McNugget proved so successful that many mistakenly came to believe that it was the clown himself who'd invented the chicken nugget. Should have gotten that patent, Baker. What's more, before the end of the 80s, McDonald's decided to double down on chicken and gave the McChicken sandwich another shot. And then, in 1988, the McChicken made its triumphant return. People seemed to want it this time around, and while it would briefly be pulled again in 1996, the McChicken had otherwise finally found its footing and was on the menu to stay. Meanwhile, other fast food chains took note of McDonald's chicken-based success and wanted in on the action too. Just 2 years after McDonald's released their McNuggets, Burger King, ever the royal copycat, came out with their first ever nugget lineup, and Wendy's and KFC soon followed suit. All the while, Chick-fil-A, which first opened its doors in 1946, claims to have beaten McDonald's to the nugget game by a whole year. On their corporate website, they claim to have first started selling nuggets in 1982 at the request of their patrons, and they soon after not only sold nuggets by the half dozen, but in huge party quantities as well. And if you ask us, that's the only size they should come in. Regardless of who was the very first to sell them, chicken nugget madness had taken over the fast food industry, and it wasn't long before home-baked nuggets came to freezer aisles everywhere. By the late 1980s, Purdue was experimenting with all sorts of nugget options, including your standard nuggets, your star-shaped nuggets, and your football nuggets. But in 1991, they would patent their biggest nuggets of all, the world's first ever Dino Nuggets, which are just chicken nuggets in fun dinosaur shapes, and not actually chunks of processed stegosaur. And with Jurassic Park coming to theaters just 2 years later, Dino Nuggets were here to stay. In 1965, the average individual American ate 36.6 pounds of chicken annually. By 2020, that number had increased threefold to just shy of 100 pounds, in no small part thanks to the advent of the chicken nugget, which today yields about 2.3 billion servings each and every year. As the years wore on, though, people started to ask, what the heck's even in these things? Way back when they first came out, McDonald's advertised the McNuggets as being savory chunks of boneless white and dark meat, dipped in a specially seasoned batter and fried to a crisp golden brown. But in the 1980s, the Federal Trade Commission began investigating the McNuggets' exact makeup, just to make sure no McBeaks or McToe Claws had found their way into the recipe. It turns out the original McNuggets were mostly thigh and breast meat, along with a little bit of skin and some salt. In 2003, they updated that recipe to include only breast meat. And in 2016, they updated it again to drop all artificial flavorings, colors, and preservatives. Still, a 2013 study by the American Journal of Medicine found that the nuggets from some fast food chains, while the exact restaurants in question were never specified, contain very little meat, and they instead are made up by as much as 60% fat, which, in fairness, still tastes delicious when you dip it in honey mustard. Around the same time as the study, America went through a pink slime scare, brought about by an expose which aired on ABC. The so-called slime, also known as finely textured beef or boneless lean beef trimmings, is a meat byproduct used as an additive in many processed meats.
This is not fit for human consumption.
Many swore off McNuggets right then and there, even though McNuggets were not and never have been made with the stuff. The McNugget had another brief setback in 2015, when one of their chicken suppliers was found to be engaged in horrific treatment of their animals. But McDonald's and Tyson both distanced themselves from said suppliers, and they've been on the upswing ever since. More recently, in 2022, TikToker Nick DiGiovanni and celebrity chef Linja teamed up to make the world's largest chicken nugget.
This nugget is almost as big as Linja.
What they made ended up at over 46 pounds and utilized 40 pounds of ground chicken, 40 eggs, half a gallon of milk, and 40 slices of bread. And while something so big no longer qualifies as a nugget, that didn't stop Nick and Linja from busting out the confetti and calling up Guinness. Now they just need a gigantic tub of ranch. When it comes to things people are pretty sure they don't want to know, what's really in a hot dog almost certainly tops that list. But our job is to be frank about such matters, so whether you've ever wanted to hear about it or not, today we're going to take a look at what's actually in a hot dog. Okay, get ready, because we've really been relishing this one. For those of you who are unfamiliar with American cuisine, or just take things too literally, a hot dog is not made for, by, or most importantly, from dogs.
Hot diggity dog! Hot dog, hot dog, hot diggity dog!
So, what is it? It's a sausage that's been boiled, steamed, or grilled, and then served resting in the open part of a partially sliced bun, usually with condiments like ketchup or mustard, and toppings like onions and sauerkraut. There are several theories as to who was the first person to put hot dogs in buns, but the meat itself probably traces its origin to Germany. Well, sausages actually go all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia, but this particular style of cased sausage is likely German. At least, the Germans think so, although they can't agree on where in Germany it's from. One theory holds that it was Frankfurt, which is why they're sometimes called Frankfurters. Another theory holds that it was Vienna, which is why they're sometimes called Wieners. Hamburg stayed out of it because obviously they have their own meat thing going on there. Given they already had two names, you're probably wondering who decided to also call them hot dogs, and why. Well, once again, it starts with the Germans. Only this time it was German immigrants in New York in the 19th century who sold them as Dachshund sausages, likely due to the resemblance to the breed of doggo that goes by that name. It's from the name Dachshund sausages that the name hot dog was ultimately derived, although a 19th century era belief that they were actually made from dog may have also played a role. Due to the fact that so many of those early vendors were Jewish butchers who observed kosher laws, American hot dogs tended to be all beef, as opposed to their German predecessors, which usually also contained pork. People must have liked the change because despite America having a pretty iffy relationship with Germany for the first half of the 20th century, the hot dog quickly became an American icon. Early hot dog vendors often sold their food from carts and are responsible for the long-time association of hot dogs with street food and carts. Cheap, fast to prepare, and easy to eat on the go, hot dogs were a perfect food for an increasingly urbanized nation, and hot dog carts are still common in cities all over the world today. But those street vendors were really only the beginning. Starting in the 1870s, iconic hot dog stands at New York's Coney Island, especially one owned by German immigrant Charles Feldman, started to create a popular association between hot dogs and leisure. That association is likely why hot dogs became common fare at baseball games, at least as early as the 1890s. And they were already wildly popular by the time of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where thousands of them were served. Incidentally, many of those were served by a company owned by a local German immigrant butcher who had a first name. It was Oscar. He also had a second name. It was Mayer. And Oscar Mayer had a way with selling meat products with his name on them at public events. The association of hot dogs with public events only continued to grow, and by the 1920s, people were eating them at everything from horse races to circuses to county fairs. Seriously, wieners were everywhere, and a big part of the credit for that has to go to a Polish immigrant named Nathan Handwerker, who opened a little place called Nathan's Famous Hot Dog Stand at Coney Island in 1916. Handwerker charged 5 cents when his competitors were charging 10, and he quickly drove them out of business. By the time of the Great Depression, Nathan's hot dogs were famous throughout the nation, and by the mid-30s, Oscar Mayer was mass-producing hot dogs for supermarkets and promoting them with a Wienermobile. Yeah, it's that old. The hot dog was becoming so mainstream that President Franklin Roosevelt served 2 of them to King George VI of England and his queen at a picnic in 1939. George, for the record, seemed to dig them. Grilling hot dogs is so deeply associated with the 4th of July, you'd think George Washington was cooking up a barbecue full of ballpark Franks at Mount Vernon while Jefferson, Adams, and Hamilton stood close by drinking beer out of camouflage cans. But the truth is, Independence Day cookouts have more to do with the suburbs than the Revolution. After World War II, Americans were flush with cash, and they started moving out to the suburbs where everybody had their own little backyard. Those backyards were the perfect place for hosting barbecues, and due to their pre-existing popularity at public events, hot dogs quickly became a cookout staple, and that included the big cookouts like those thrown for the 4th of July. The association between hot dogs and America took root.
Oh my God, you look like the 4th of July. It makes me want a hot dog real bad.
And today, Americans consume somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 million hot dogs on the 4th of July alone. In fact, hot dogs are an almost ubiquitous part of American culture, and every city has its own style. In New York, they're usually topped with a spicy brown mustard, sautéed onions, or sauerkraut, whereas in Chicago, they come in a poppy seed bun with a mountain of toppings like tomato, pickle spears, sweet onions, hot peppers, and relish. Atlanta tops their dogs with cool, crunchy slaw, while Detroit prefers theirs covered in beef chili, shredded cheddar, and raw onions. In San Francisco, you might get one with creamy mayo and smoky bacon, which also happens to be popular in southwestern cities. In Tucson and Phoenix, for example, people enjoy a hot dog that's wrapped in bacon, topped with pinto beans, mayo, mustard, onion, chopped tomatoes, and jalapenos. Hot dogs in Milwaukee are often served on a toasted hard roll rather than a traditional hot dog bun, and they can be topped with butter, mustard, pickles, and sauerkraut. And the people of New Jersey also like to mix things up. In Newark, for example, hot dogs can come on an Italian roll with peppers, onions, and fried potatoes. According to Nathan Handwerker held his first 4th of July hot dog eating contest way back in 1916 as a way to settle a bet between 4 immigrants who each claimed to be more patriotic than each other. If that sounds too incredible to be true, well, that's because it is. While there certainly were hot dog eating contests, at least as early as the 1920s, there's not a lot of evidence Nathan's held one until 1967, and they didn't start the 4th of July tradition until 1972. Nonetheless, it's generally considered to be a marketing bonanza for the company and has drawn big ratings for ESPN, who recently signed up to televise the contest at least through 2029. The always colorful competition has been especially controversial as of late due to the 2024 banning of 16-time champion Joey Chestnut, arguably the greatest professional eater in the world.
Which on this earth can suck down the most amount of hot dogs and buns? And it is always one name. Joey Chestnut.
Chestnut was locked out of the competition after signing a deal with Impossible Food, which manufactures plant-based hot dogs. Since the hot dog eating contest is supposed to promote Nathan's brand, Major League Eating prohibits Chestnut from endorsing a second hot dog maker, and his new deal therefore meant he couldn't compete. Making the best of a bad situation, Chestnut instead opted to compete in an eating contest at Fort Bliss, where he helped raise over $100,000 for Operation Homefront. Given that Chestnut is pretty much the LeBron James of pro eaters, and their contest is far less of a spectacle without him, we wouldn't be shocked if Nathan's pulled out all of the stops to get him back in the fold. Of course, it asks the question, why would Joey Chestnut, of all people, look for an alternative to good old hot dogs, the meat that made him famous? Is it a truckload of money, or because he thinks something could be wrong with hot dogs? For as long as there have been hot dogs, there have been people who suspected that hot dogs were filled with the most disgusting ingredients they can possibly think of, and with good reason. Upton Sinclair's famous 1905 meat industry expose, The Jungle, confirmed that early 20th century meatpacking plants were a nightmare, routinely using super shady ingredients like sawdust and horse meat, and a whole bunch of other nasty things we won't name in case you're eating, including entire workers. After that, meatpacking plants were regulated and had to abide by strict guidelines designed to protect consumers from eating anything too disgusting. A few unfortunate things have still slipped into the mix here and there. For example, Americans have reported additional ingredients including hair, metal shavings, ants, silverfish, insect larvae, a rubber band, needles, a coin, a pill, bone, wire, plastic, and part of a box cutter.
You know what they make those things out of, huh, Chet? You know? Lips and ass.
Despite how this makes it sound, such ingredients are extremely rare. As of 2015, out of the billions of hot dogs sold and consumed nationwide, the U.S. government had just 38 reports of foreign objects found in hot dogs. So that must mean hot dogs aren't as bad as you think, right? Well, here are some facts, and then you can decide. The USDA says that at least 54.5% of a hot dog must be real meat. So those dogs you buy at the supermarket probably are really made of beef, chicken, pork, or turkey, but they're often made from what they call the trimmings of the animal. Those are the meat cuts discarded by the slaughterhouse, which include things like fatty tissue, sinewy muscle, liver parts, and sometimes even meat from the animal's head. That's the smartest meat. That stuff is then cooked to kill bacteria, turned into a paste via emulsion, mixed with any number of filler products, and then pureed and stuffed into a sausage case. Some flavoring and preservatives are usually thrown in there for a good measure. And while there's a little more to it, that's essentially how every hot dog is born. Of course, some products are definitely manufactured at higher levels of quality than others. For example, if the words variety meats or meat byproducts appear in the list of ingredients, there's a good chance your dog contains heart and other organ material. Conversely, if it says something like all beef or all pork on the package, you're probably okay on that front. And if it doesn't say it's all natural, then there's probably MSG and additives like nitrates in it. That being said, many have pointed out that by allowing the consumption of parts that would have otherwise been discarded, hot dogs make animal consumption more sustainable for society, and additives like nitrates actually prevent botulism, so picking the right hot dog for you might be more complicated than it seems. Maybe next time just go for the chicken fingers? Spam is easily the most famous meat that comes in a can. Some find it a revolting pile of sludge. Others swear by it as a delicious mealtime staple. But where did this mystery meat come from, and how has it stayed so popular? Today, we're uncovering the history of Spam. Okay, time to pull open this tin of salty treats, and we don't need sardines. Back in the early 1900s, no one wanted to eat pork shoulder. It was tough and required a long time to cook. Plus, it's where the pigs tended to get their most ferocious tattoos. Nowadays, pork shoulder is a crock-pot staple, but slow cookers were still decades away. In the meantime, pork distributors had to find new and innovative ways to get people to buy this unappealing cut of meat. And J. Hormel, heir to the Hormel Company dynasty, was just the man for the job. But before Jay was even a twinkle in his father's eye, his dad, George Hormel, was learning the basics of meat. George dropped out of school at 13 and landed a Chicago meatpacking job. Because if we read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle correctly, nothing builds character like meat factory work. He took to the trade like a kid to a candy store. And over the next 14 years, he would travel all over the Midwest as he chased meaty job after meaty job. When George was 27, he decided to take charge and start a business of his own. He finally settled down in Austin, Minnesota in 1891, where he founded George A. Hormel & Company, a business that primarily packaged fresh pork. Geez, let's hope it was primarily fresh. 1 year later, Jay Hormel was born. As his father's only child, Jay was later described as smaller, not particularly athletic, and somewhat erratic, so a theater kid. After briefly attending Princeton before being called home by his father, Jay Hormel was sent to war in 1917. Historically speaking, this was a particularly bad time to be sent to war. Upon returning from Europe, Jay found his father's company in shambles. The assistant comptroller had embezzled over $1 million of the company's money, about $20 million in today's currency, or about 5.6 million cans of Spam. And the company suddenly found itself broke. If they wanted to survive, they needed a sharp pivot. George and Jay took out a loan, fired all of the company's executives, and changed their business model. Instead of selling exclusively fresh pork, they would begin canning some of that sweet pig chowder so that they could sell it to a wider audience across the country. Thus, in 1926, the father-son pair created the nation's first canned ham. While Hormel Sr. was less enthusiastic about the venture, Jay went hog bonkers for the idea. That's the expression, right? Hog bonkers? The younger Hormel dropped $500,000 marketing the new canned product. George's concerns were quickly allayed, though, and the gamble paid off. Their canned ham soon became a grocery store staple, and the business was back on its feet, or hooves, you could say. They have a pig-based revenue stream. Hormel quickly went all in on their canned meat lineup. A year later, they introduced Spam's predecessor, the spiced canned ham. The following year, they even branched out into creating canned chicken products as well. Chicken breast in a can. Can't wait to spread that on a cracker, or however the hell you're supposed to eat it. George soon stepped back from managing the business, putting Jay in charge of the growth of their burgeoning canned pork empire. The Hormel Company's sales numbers slipped as the country entered the Great Depression. In fairness, everyone was pretty light on cash at the time. They were once more in need of a company-wide pivot, and they found it in the scorned pork shoulder. Pork shoulder was dirt cheap because nobody wanted it. Jay Hormel decided to try and repackage it in a form that people would actually want to eat. By mixing it with water, salt, sugar, potato starch, and sodium nitrate, he created an all-new product. It just needed a name. So, on New Year's Eve, Jay threw a party. Each of his 65 guests was given a blank slip of paper at the door. They were directed to write down a potential name for his new canned ham product. For each completed entry, the guest would be rewarded with an alcoholic beverage. According to Jay himself, it was by the third or fourth entries, and consequently by the third or fourth drinks, that the suggestions started getting good. It takes at least that long to weed out all the Porky McPorkface and Cam, the ham in a can suggestions. Kenneth Denyo, the brother of a Hormel Company vice president, came up with a name that would stick, both in our memories and presumably also to the wall: Spam. While Denyo was awarded $100 for naming Spam, the word's meaning or how he came up with it is still hotly contested. Its all-caps packaging has led some to think it's an acronym, but even that's a matter of debate. Some say it stands for Shoulder of Pork and Ham. Wait, wouldn't that be SPA? Alternatively, it could stand for the considerably less appetizing scientifically processed animal matter, which kind of sounds like an alien trying to describe taxidermy. Most commonly, though, Spam is thought of to be a portmanteau of the word spiced and ham. Regardless of what its name actually meant, Spam was set for distribution, and in the summer of 1937, it hit U.S. markets for the first time. Jay Hormel captained Spam's launch, leaning into his previous strategy of mass marketing the new product with a steady stream of radio and magazine ads, spreading the word about the salty new delicacy.
Spam is that delicious meat originated and made only by Hormel.
And within 3 years of it hitting the market, over 70% of urban-dwelling Americans had given Spam a try. Still, many suburban and rural consumers were wary of canned meat because they didn't believe that non-refrigerated meat could possibly be safe to eat. This is a healthy concern to have in the early 20th century. But fortunately for Hormel, the U.S. Armed Forces had no such reservations. World War II brought canned meat to the forefront of American life. The war is also notable for other reasons, but mostly the canned meat. By the war's end, over 150 million pounds of canned pork products had been purchased and distributed by the Army. That is a lot of cocktail weenies. Some soldiers said they were fed Spam up to 3 times a day during their deployment. Needless to say, many GIs were thoroughly over canned pork products by the time they came home. And while Spam was just one of many pork luncheon products that the U.S. Armed Forces purchased, Spam's name recognition caused it to receive the brunt of the military's ire. All those radio ads really did the trick. Popular military newspapers referred to it as meatloaf without basic training and said that Spam was the real reason war was held. Some even rebranded the beloved Uncle Sam character as the derisive Uncle Spam. Spam became so disliked that some soldiers found alternative uses for it, including using its grease to lubricate their weapons and to waterproof their boots, and to keep the enemy from coming within smelling distance from the sound of it. Other nations were a little more grateful for Spam. Russia's Nikita Khrushchev said in his biography that Spam was what kept the Russian army from starving after the German devastation of Russian and Ukrainian agriculture. And many Russians came to refer to Spam as Roosevelt sausage. Hopefully that's a nickname and not what they thought was in it. In Italy and England, Spam even became a sort of currency that could be traded for all sorts of favors, ranging from manual labor to, shall we say, romantic dalliances. Still, the Hormel company was worried that war-fatigued U.S. veterans would want nothing to do with their product upon returning home, which was probably true. They braced themselves for financial collapse at the close of World War II. Fortunately for them, there seemed to have been a silent but loyal contingent of Spam-obsessed soldiers who brought their secret love of Spam home to their families. For many of those households, Spam soon shifted away from being a dinner-time centerpiece and instead became the steady occupant of a breakfast side plate, like bacon or sausage, or those 2 slices of toast that nobody ever eats. During the war years, the U.S. government's distrust of Japan and of Japanese Americans led to the banning of deep-sea fishing off the coasts of Hawaii. Boat traffic coming in and out of the islands was viewed as a potential national security threat, so they placed heavy restrictions on who could come and go. This led to a shortage of fresh fish, and canned meat became the only way many Hawaiians could get good protein into their diets, unless they started eating quinoa, and who the hell wants to do that? It wasn't long before Spam became a local commodity, and Hawaiian residents were quick to incorporate Spam into traditional Hawaiian, Japanese, and Korean dishes. This led to the creation of Spam musubi, a Hawaiian take on onigiri that wraps together cooked Spam with rice and a piece of nori. There was also Spam fried rice, Spam wontons, and a dish called Spam lokomoko, which is a Hawaiian dish that traditionally contains white rice, hamburger, and fried egg, topped with brown gravy, and Spam. Today, the average Hawaiian eats almost 4 pounds of Spam per year. More if there were any contests. That's almost 7 million cans per year. There's even an annual Spam festival in Honolulu. It's called the Waikiki Spam Jam, and it boasts dozens of Hawaiian vendors, along with live music and in-costume Spam mascots. Listen, they are really into Spam down there. Meanwhile, in the mainland USA, Spam underwent an entirely different post-war transformation. After Spam was demoted to a mere breakfast side, the Hormel company upped its game. Jay, crazy like a canned fox Hormel, lent his golden touch to one final marketing campaign, ordering the hiring of 60 talented female World War II veterans. Dubbed the Hormel Girls, the women would sing songs about Spam products.
Pie, pie, tater pie, E-I-E-E-I-P pie. Eeper, Iper, Pacific Piper, we just love that tater pie.
And travel the nation to compete in local music competitions and participate in small-town parades. They even launched their own radio show called Music with the Hormel Girls, which was the 4th highest-rated show for the year 1953. It was really good, or there wasn't a lot to do back then. Jay Hormel passed away in 1954, but his strategy and legacy would pay off and grow Spam's reputation throughout the rest of the decade. And in 1959, Spam sold its billionth can. Spam's growth continued into the 1960s as many Americans became more comfortable with processed meat products and began incorporating them into daily life. The spreadable can of former pig was finally getting the respect it deserved. But unfortunately for Hormel, Spam's hot streak was about to hit a speed bump in the form of a surrealist English comedy troupe. Monty Python's Flying Circus began airing on the BBC in the first half of the 1970s. The show is a well-loved cult classic, and its cast members have become comedy icons in the decades since. One of the group's most famous sketches takes place in a diner that sells nothing but Spam, to the growing frustration of a bewildered customer.
Spam, egg, spam, spam, bacon, and spam.
Also, there's Vikings. It's a weird show. Spam quickly became the butt of a global joke. The company tried to course correct by leaning into their earlier marketing strategies and shutting down any attempts to mock their products. They even sued the Muppets over their
Spat
character. But Jim Henson Productions ultimately won out. Quick tip, if you're trying to repair your public image, maybe don't sue the Muppets. But things can always get worse. The rise of the internet saw the rise of spam emails, a derogatory term for unwanted messages, named after Hormel's product. With that, there was no longer any use fighting against the widespread bad vibes surrounding spam.
I guess we really need to be with the joke.
So they put out an official statement that acknowledged and embraced the unstoppable connection drawn between unwanted emails and spam's canned meats. Hormel only asked that people refrain from using all capital letters when talking about spam emails. Wait, spam is supposed to be all caps? They even went on to sponsor Monty Python's 2005 musical, Spam-A-Lot, and presumably sent the Muppets an apologetic note and an edible arrangement of spam. Rolling with the punches seems to have paid off. In recent years, spam has grown bigger than ever before. Spam has now seen year-over-year sales growth for nearly a decade and has expanded its product line to include a multitude of flavors and styles, like teriyaki, hot and spicy, hickory smoked, and oven-roasted turkey. Wait, is it turkey-flavored spam or actual turkey? Well, not actual turkey. So crack open a tin and grab yourself a fork because there's a spam for every mood. There was even a limited edition pumpkin spice spam, for those days when you really want to silence the break room. Who among us hasn't stumbled home after a night out, stepped into the kitchen, and opened the fridge only to find it empty, except for a dog-eared package of bologna and half a squeeze bottle of mayo? Do you sulk? Let the refrigerator door swing shut while you mope off to bed? But what is bologna? You eat it, you love it, but can you wax poetic about it? Today on Weird History Food, we're going to talk about the history of bologna. Okay, time to get to the bottom of my bologna. What it isn't is a mystery meat, despite popular belief. Bologna, or Bologna, or bologna, whatever your pronunciation, is pork, beef, chicken, turkey, or a combination thereof that is finely ground with fat, salt, and spices, a delicious seasoned meat paste. There might be nondescript trimmings in there, fatty cuts and butchery byproducts like organ meat, but let's just leave it at that as far as the mystery surrounding bologna goes. The spices can include black pepper, myrtle berries, nutmeg, allspice, celery seed, and coriander, and are identified only as flavorings or spices on the ingredient label. This tasty mixture is shaped into a loaf and cooked and sliced and packaged for your use as a meaty hangover suppressor. The best meats come in loaves. Ask for bologna in Italy and the Italians will wince at your pronunciation and then point to a spot on the map in the north-central part of the country. In Italy, Bologna, not pronounced Bologna, is primarily a city, not a cold cut. And Bologna is where the thick Italian sausage called mortadella originated centuries ago. Mortadella, bologna's exalted ancestor, was considered a delicacy. It was made by grinding pork meat into a paste that was mixed with cubed fats and spices, stuffed into a casing, and cooked. The sausage takes its name from the Italian mortaio, or mortar, which was used to break down pork. Its full name is Mortaio della Carne di Maiale, mortadella for short.
Che buona mortadella.
The pigs from which mortadella was made were so important a commodity that, as far back as the year 1000, the forests they inhabited were measured not in surface area, but by the number of animals they could support. Mortadella was so prized that an organization of charcuterers was founded in the 1200s to police its method of production. By the 1700s, if you were a salumiere, someone who made salumi, or cured meats, and your mortadella didn't cut the mustard, so to speak, you could be fined or even stretched on the rack, and your inventory could be destroyed. Subpar mortadella, therefore, might have been called something completely different, the name of the town in which it was made, something like Bologna. So why doesn't bologna look like mortadella? The U.S. Department of Agriculture requires that the ingredients in bologna be comminuted or reduced to minute particles. Thus, the fat and spices in bologna are invisible, whereas those in mortadella are extremely visible and give the sausage an appetizingly mottled appearance. That's right, hide your shame, bologna. Hide your delicious, delicious shame. We've determined that our pink paste subject was probably named for the city in which it, or its predecessor Mortadella, was born. But in Italy, that city is pronounced Bologna, so why do we call this sweetmeat Bologna? Linguist Mark Lieberman's theory postulates that anglicized pronunciations of Italian place names like Italia, Sicilia, and Lombardia become clipped. So Italia becomes Italy, Sicilia becomes Sicily, and so on. Lieberman also points out that the city of Bologna was called Bologna way back in the day. So it sounds plausible that Bologna might be an anglicized version of the city's name.
Bologna. Bologna.
Other theories cite early Italian Americans' penchant for shortening or changing the pronunciation of Italian words as they imported them into American English dialect. Take, for example, rigat for ricotta or prosciutto for prosciutto. It could be that Bologna was shortened to Boulogne, and eventually the Y was tacked on at the end. Or perhaps the pronunciation change was as simple as the influence of the British word blarney, or the widespread Irish name Maloney, both of which would have been common words around the time the pronunciation change happened. Whatever the origin, lexicographer Ben Zimmer notes that the ni pronunciation of the sausage was widely used in the 19th century, around the time other Italian place names were likely being anglicized. A humor piece being published in 1857 referring to bologna sausage is the earliest example he's found. Sounds like a Chicago beat cop ordering lunch. The point is, nobody really knows how the change in pronunciation came about. And for that matter, how did the word bologna come to be synonymous with nonsense? Well, that's a whole other subject to sink your teeth into.
Yeah, that's a lot of baloney.
Despite its Italian lineage, American bologna probably traces its particular ancestry to German immigrants who settled in the Midwest in the 1800s. They brought with them the sausages and methods of production of their homeland, wursts of every variety. The best of the worst, if you will. One of these immigrants was Oskar Ferdinand Meyer, who came to the U.S. from Bavaria with his family in 1873 at age 14. And just like that, everyone's ears just perked up. Yeah, that Oskar Meyer. He apprenticed with a butcher and then spent 6 years working in a meatpacking plant. By 1880, he was itching to go into business for himself. He wrote to a brother, Gottfried, in Germany, and encouraged him to take up sausage making. Gottfried apparently liked the idea, learned his chops, pun intended, then joined Oskar in the U.S. The pair leased a failing meat market in Chicago in 1883 and opened up shop. On their first day, they made $59, the equivalent of about $1,700 in today's money. So the company's prospects seemed good. So good, in fact, that when their lease expired in 1888, the landlord refused to renew, thinking he might go back into business for himself and capitalize on the Myers' reputation. Oskar and his brother moved on, borrowed $10,000, and bought their own building nearby. Another brother, Max, came on as the business's accountant. The new venture was an immediate success, with neighbors flocking to the shop for old-world sausages and meat. Over the nearly century and a half since Oskar Meyer has prospered, not only due to its products but also as a result of its innovation, think vacuum-sealed packaging, which prevents waste, or pre-sliced bacon. Yeah, really think about pre-sliced bacon.
I mean, look how thin that is. See, that's all surface area. The taste has nowhere to hide.
And of course, there was the marketing. In 1929, Oskar Meyer's ubiquitous yellow band trademark made its debut and continues to exist in modified form to this day. The Wienermobile and its pilot, a little person known as Little Oscar, first appeared in 1936 and would be a part of the company's promotional strategy for decades. These days, the cheeky Oskar Meyer fleet includes a hot dog delivering Wiener Mini, a Wiener Cycle, a Wiener Drone, and a Wiener Rover, in addition to the classic Wienermobile. And then there are the jingles. Oh, I'd love to be an Oskar Meyer wiener.
That's what they like to me.
Sorry, my version may have reminded you of the jingles, so it'll be in your head all day. Maybe this will help. My bologna has a first name. Do 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 do. I always wanted to punch that kid. Bologna's popularity rose with that of all Oskar Meyer products, but not solely because of the company's success. Along with technological advances in the 1920s came a faster pace of business. Lunchtime began to lose its leisurely vibe, giving rise to the sandwich. The New York Times proclaimed in 1924 that the day of the sandwich has arrived. Men have no time to sit around leisurely waiting for large orders. They must grab a bite, preferably wholesome and satisfying, but essentially without delay. So instead of a steaming plate of corned beef and cabbage or steak and onions, working men started tucking into shaved ham and cheese with horseradish and mustard between 2 slices of bread, or more likely, instead of tucking in, wrapping it to go. Unfortunately, the Great Depression struck just a few years later, following the stock market crash of 1929. Suddenly, finding a quick bite to eat for lunch was no longer the problem. Millions of Americans were having trouble finding anything to eat at all. Soup kitchens appeared, with long lines of the unemployed queuing up for something hot. Meat was scarce and expensive. For those who could afford it, bologna was an economical alternative. It kept well and was made of less expensive parts of the animal. That trend continued during the war years of the 1940s when, again, meat was an expensive commodity and subjected to war rationing. In the workplace, sandwiches of bologna and other processed meats such as Spam were common for lunch.
A double-decker bologna sandwich!
Workers might then go home for a dinner of fried bologna. Bologna for every meal of the day was the cure weary Americans needed. Bologna got another boost as a source of fuel for America's inquiring young minds. In the opening years of the 20th century, most school kids went home for lunch. In the 20s and 30s, however, many schools began offering free or low-cost lunches. Since bologna was relatively inexpensive, it became a popular lunchtime staple. Then, in 1946, President Truman signed the National School Lunch Act, establishing lunch programs nationwide. Bologna fit the bill nicely. It was relatively cheap, filling, and easy to prepare, favored by students and harried lunch ladies alike. One concoction that may stand out, especially for school kids in the South, the bologna boat, a slice of bologna topped with mashed potatoes and cheese. Climb aboard! The mid-20th century also saw the rise of refrigeration and grocery store refrigerated sections. Convenience foods like bologna, which were packaged in plastic and had a long shelf life, were popular with busy parents too. But flavor and freshness do not always equate to a food's health benefits. For this and other reasons, not everybody is a bologna fan.
I hate bologna, like more than anything else in the world. Oh! Spit it out.
No doubt, some of those school kids gagged on bologna sandwich day. And more than one prison riot has been blamed on the meals inmates are fed, many of which include cold bologna sandwiches, sometimes more than once a day. Bologna contains high amounts of sodium, fat, and disconcerting-sounding ingredients like potassium acetate and sodium erythorbate. Potassium acetate is used as a preservative and acidity regulator in food. But another of its applications is as a runway de-icer, icy deliciousness. The World Health Organization has classified processed meats like bologna, sausages, and deli ham as a Group 1 carcinogen, which means that there's evidence that processed meats can increase your risk of cancer, especially of the bowel and stomach. So bologna is probably not an everyday food, if you're paying attention to your intake of salt, fat, and preservatives. Despite its questionable health benefits and its reputation as cheap, processed junk food, bologna still finds its way onto the menu of butcher shops and fine dining establishments across America. Today, there are plenty of places to get high-end bologna. The Midwest is studded with old-world-type sausage makers that sling the meat, like Usinger's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Frick's Quality Meats in Washington, Missouri, Kogel's in Flint, Michigan, and the list goes on. With all that delicious bologna at their disposal, it's only natural that chefs across the country would be putting it to use. Fried bologna sandwiches? We got them. Thick-cut, thin-shaved American cheese or cheddar. What's your pleasure? There are bologna salad sandwiches, German pasta salad with bologna, even mini corn dogs called French poodles, which incorporate that Midwestern classic, ring bologna. In 2017, Bon Appetit named New Orleans restaurant Turkey and the Wolf the best restaurant of the year. The restaurant's fried bologna sandwich in particular received an extremely enthusiastic review from critic Andy Knowlton, who wrote, "Chef-owner Mason Hereford's take on a bologna sandwich had nothing in common with the mayo and Wonder Bread ones I grew up eating. In his, 3 slices of locally made bologna were griddle fried, blanketed in American cheese, and stacked on thick-cut, butter-griddled Pullman slices with house-made hot mustard, Duke's brand mayo, and shreddus, what Mason calls shredded lettuce. It was further crunchified with 2 fistfuls of vinegar-brined potato chips. That does sound like a pretty damn good sandwich. Chef Matt Bolis, who runs restaurants in Nashville and Louisville, summed up bologna this way: "Fried bologna is good for your soul. Cold bologna can be just as delicious when done right. I mean, really, all bologna is good for the soul. It's the food of the people. Bologna, the soulful deli meat of the people. What's good for the soul is also good for the complexion, right?" Bologna's popularity as a comfort food item isn't limited to menus. Oscar Mayer is upping its bologna game with a recent foray into the world of skincare with the officially branded Oscar Mayer Bologna Hydrogel Sheet Face Mask. Hey, maybe that de-icer will strip the wrinkles from your complexion. An Oscar Mayer marketing exec says the meaty facializer is inspired by those who used to playfully make masks out of their bologna as kids. This product was born as a modern-day way to spark smiles for fans of Oscar Mayer and beauty enthusiasts alike. And hey, if the masks are sold out, you can always make yours the old-fashioned way. It doesn't take a whiz to see that people love Cheez Whiz. Of course, just because we love Cheez Whiz doesn't mean that we actually know what's in it. Heck, is it even made of cheese? We're glad you asked, because today we're going to take a look at what's actually in Cheez Whiz. Okay, we're off to see the whiz. In case you are unfamiliar with it, Cheez Whiz is an orangey yellowish cheese-like goo produced by the crafty folks at Kraft Foods, which is now technically the Kraft Heinz company. Debuting on supermarket shelves way back in 1952, Cheez Whiz can be used as a sauce, spread, or topping for just about any kind of food you can imagine, or enjoyed on its own, if you're a real hero. It's sold in glass jars and shouldn't be confused with Easy Cheese, which is that spray cheese which comes in aerosol cans. Now you know the difference, even if the Blues Brothers didn't.
You give me my Cheez Whiz, boy?
Cheez Whiz has long been popular in America and is now a common topping for snack staples like hot dogs, french fries, corn chips, and pretzels. And with a quick Google search, you can also easily find recipes for dishes like the Cheez Whiz frittata, chili cheese dog egg rolls, or stuffed crust pretzel pizza, all made with whiz. It's also a must-have ingredient if you're going to make a genuine Philly cheesesteak, which raises a philosophical question. Is a cheesesteak still a cheesesteak if there's barely any real cheese on it? Because while Cheez Whiz did once contain a good amount of real cheese, that was a really long time ago. Today, Cheez Whiz, which is officially a cheese dip according to its label, likely contains no more cheese than the 51% required by the Federal Trade Commission. And even then, it's not really cheese as you think of it. One former Kraft employee compared the flavor of the present version to axle grease, although it's presumably easier to spread on crackers. Kraft officials insist cheese is still the primary ingredient in Cheez Whiz, but they won't say how much is in there. And cheese doesn't actually appear on the ingredients list, although Kraft insists that all of the component ingredients that make up cheese are included. So what does appear on the list? Things like milk, canola oil, maltodextrin, sodium phosphate, salt, lactic acid, mustard flour, and, among other things, Worcestershire sauce. Cheese culture is included on the label, but that's just a bacteria that plays a key role in the cheese-making process, and not something you'd want to put on a footlong. The main ingredient in Cheez Whiz is actually whey, which is the liquid that cheese curds release during the cheese-making process. But it's just in the recipe to give Cheez Whiz its consistency. The truth is, Cheez Whiz is mostly oil, salty flavorings, preservatives, and chemicals to control its color, thickness, and texture. In fairness, they spelled cheese with a Z, so we shouldn't be expecting farm-fresh dairy here. But long story short, Cheez Whiz technically doesn't contain any real cheese at all. It contains processed cheese, and that is something very different. In a cheese-dipped nutshell, processed cheese is cheese containing additives. Those additives typically include, but are not limited to, things like salt, sugar, oils, unfermented dairy ingredients, food coloring, and various emulsifying agents. And thanks to all of that other stuff, processed cheese can come in a bewildering variety of tastes, textures, flavors, and colors. Your average hunk of processed cheese usually contains somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60% cheese in it, with Cheez Whiz likely weighing in on the lighter end. Processed cheese was invented in Switzerland by Walter Gerber and Fritz Stettler in 1911. Inspired by various qualities of cheese sauce and fondue, the pair mixed some melted Emmentaler cheese with an emulsifier called sodium citrate and found that the emulsified cheese sauce that resulted could be made solid again. Just 5 years later, a new method for halting the maturation of cheese during processing would be patented by one James L. Kraft. Yeah, that Kraft. Thanks to innovations like these, the stage was set for processed cheese to ooze across the surface of the earth for decades to come. Despite being only technically partially cheese, processed cheese has a number of upsides. For one, its shelf life is a whole lot longer than cheese made by conventional methods. Processed cheese also has meltability, which means it doesn't separate when it's cooked, and heating doesn't alter its taste or texture. As a result, it can be used in a vast array of recipes that simply wouldn't work with unprocessed cheese. For the robber barons of the world, processed cheese provides a number of manufacturing advantages as well. For example, processed cheese is easier to produce with a consistent taste and texture. It's also much, much cheaper to make, at a much larger scale, at a far faster pace. Those savings are largely passed on to consumers, who are typically charged a lot less for a hunk of processed cheese than for one made by conventional methods. And consumers don't seem to mind. After all, nobody has ever stopped to ask the cashier whether the Doritos are made with real cheese. Consequently, there are a lot of processed cheese products on the market, including the aforementioned Easy Cheese, as well as Velveeta, both of which also happen to be Kraft products. The history of Cheez Whiz actually begins with the aforementioned James L. Kraft. Born in December of 1874 in Ontario, Canada, Kraft moved to the U.S. in 1903 and started a door-to-door wholesale cheese business, as we've all considered doing at one time or another. Business wasn't so hot at first, but Kraft held on, and in 1909 he was joined by his brothers, renaming the company J.L. Kraft & Brothers Company. It's not the most imaginative name, but they were focusing all their creativity on the cheese game. By 1914, they were selling 31 different varieties of cheese, and in 1915, they would invent the processed cheese they patented in 1916. They would then sell 6 million pounds of that processed cheese to the U.S. military for use in World War I, presumably to feed the troops, though we can't rule out the possibility they were working on experimental cheese weaponry. In 1924, the company became the Kraft Cheese Company and went public. The next few decades would see a host of mergers and acquisitions that would set Kraft on the road to being the corporate giant it is today. And in 1950, they would introduce their now trademark pre-sliced American cheese slices under the name Kraft Deluxe Processed Slices, later to be renamed Kraft Singles, like a fun dating site. Kraft Singles were a massive success, and it was James Kraft's desire to further cash in on that success that led to the development of Cheez Whiz. Took a while, but we got there. After he saw how well Singles did in the US, Kraft set his eyes on the British market, and the British were known to enjoy a snack called a Welsh rarebit, or Welsh rabbit, even though it does not contain any rabbit. Welsh rarebit is actually just a slice of toast with melted cheddar on it. And because snacking and doing as little as possible go hand in hand, Kraft figured Brits would appreciate an imitation rarebit cheese sauce they didn't have to melt themselves. To that end, the company assigned one Edward Traisman to lead the team that would develop Cheez Whiz. It made its debut in 1952, and the British absolutely loved it. It was such a hit, Kraft decided to bring it to America the following year. And the rest, as they say, is whiz-story. Since Cheez Whiz was such an immediate success, Kraft has expanded the line over the years to an almost dizzying degree. For example, there's Cheez Whiz Light, Cheez Whiz Italia, Cheez Whiz Tex-Mex, Cheez Whiz Bacon, Cheez Whiz Pimento, and Cheez Whiz Salsa con Queso. Wait, shouldn't that be called Salsa con Cheez Whiz? There's even something called Cheez Whiz Burger flavor, which is only available in the Philippines. But if you're not a local, it sounds like it's worth the trip. And speaking of intriguing flavors, back in 2016, the fast food chain chain Wayback Burger played an April Fool's joke on the public by announcing a new milkshake made with Cheez Whiz. The chain actually went to the trouble of creating the milkshake and handed out 12-ounce cups to its customers at select locations in California, Connecticut, Florida, Massachusetts, Michigan, and New York. Unfortunately for Whiz lovers, they only did that for one day. So if you want to try a Cheez Whiz milkshake now, you'll have to make it yourself. There's probably a YouTube tutorial out there somewhere. Finally, we turn to Cheez Whiz's influence in the sphere of American politics. That sounds like a joke, but when it comes to cheese, we are always serious. Cheez Whiz once arguably changed the course of American political history. But to understand that, you need to understand the Great Philly Cheesesteak debate. You see, just like champagne can only be called champagne if it was made in that specific region of France, there are those who believe it can only be called a Philly cheesesteak if it's made with Cheez Whiz. Otherwise, it's just a steak sandwich with cheese on it you may or may not be ordering in Philadelphia. This is by no means a universally held opinion, and there are plenty of great regional takes on the Philly cheesesteak that use other types of cheese. Furthermore, the original cheese associated with the Philly cheesesteak when it first became popular in the 1940s was provolone. Cheez Whiz didn't become the standard until after the product made its debut in the US in the 1950s. Today, you can order one by simply asking for a whiz, and ordering a Philly cheesesteak with any other kind of cheese can be considered a major faux pas. Former Senator John Kerry learned that the hard way when he ran for president back in 2003 and stopped at Pat's King of Steaks in Philly to order a good old-fashioned Philly cheesesteak in front of reporters and cameras, like a normal person. It was all going well until Kerry ordered his cheesesteak with Swiss. This was essentially the same as asking for one with Raisin Bran on it. Kerry was ridiculed for his lunch order failure in the media, with one prominent local food critic citing it as evidence of an alternative lifestyle. While he did manage to eke out a win in Pennsylvania, it was way closer than initially predicted, and he ultimately lost the election to George W. Bush without ever fully recovering from Cheesesteak Gate. We cannot definitively say there was a cause and effect relationship between Kerry's bungled lunch order and his 2004 loss, but we also can't rule it out. At least he didn't ask for any Heinz. Whether it's McDonald's Big Mac, Burger King's Whopper, or White Castle's Sliders, most of us have a favorite fast food hamburger. But, possibly because we believe ignorance is bliss, very few of us have taken the time to learn what's in them. You know, besides the special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions, and
sesame bun.
So, today we're going to take a look at what's really in fast food hamburgers. Okay, time to throw a few patties of weird history on the grill. Even though it would be a while before drive-thrus were a thing, the story of fast food really starts with the automobile. After World War I, cars became more affordable, which made them more popular. And to cater to these increasingly mobile Americans, drive-in restaurants were born. The early wave of drive-ins allowed customers to sit in their car while being waited on by servers called car hops. And the menu at the drive-ins was basically the same burgers, fries, and shakes that fast food joints are now generally associated with. But the food was cooked to order, like at a traditional diner. The first fast food restaurant, as we think of them today, opened its doors in 1921, and it's one you've probably heard of, especially if you're into the Harold and Kumar movies. That's right, it was White Castle. Founded by Billy Ingram and Walter Anderson, the very first White Castle was located in Wichita, Kansas, and it sold burgers for a whopping 5 cents apiece. White Castle was a huge success, and their assembly line style of making burgers would become the model for the fast food industry, right up to the present. Even industry leader McDonald's, founded by Richard and Maurice McDonald in 1940, would utilize a similar model. But it would really be thanks to a combination of factors in the post-World War II economic boom of the 1950s that fast food would really blow up. For one, Americans had more money than ever, and suddenly realized they loved to eat out. The U.S. also built an elaborate network of roads and highways, which encouraged Americans to travel. That meant they needed more places to stop and eat, and places with familiar branding menus, like fast food chains, had an edge with travelers in strange territory. McDonald's began to spread across the country like a plague, and dozens of other fast food places did the same in its wake. For better or worse, fast food was on its way to being an American way of life. Today, of course, no one is ever that far from a Mickey D's, or a Burger King, or Wendy's, White Castle, Jack in the Box, Hardee's, Carl's Jr., Checkers, Five Guys, In-N-Out, Whataburger, or any other of 100 similar chains. Over the decades, these places have collectively served hundreds of billions of hamburgers. And as you might imagine, it has cost a lot of cows their hides. Hamburgers are, of course, made of beef. More specifically, ground beef, which is then shaped into patties of various sizes and thicknesses. So understanding fast food hamburgers means backing up a little to talk about the beef industry. Beef technically comes from a domestic bovine, like steer, bull, ox, or cow. We'll call them all cattle. And raising all that cattle to make all that beef requires a whole industrial process. That process starts with that cattle standing around in fields, eating grass, and watching people drive by while shouting, "We got cows!" After a period of pasture foraging, primarily on non-crop lands, of the cattle stock in the U.S., which is around 90 million heads in 2024, a certain percentage is destined for feedlots, some after conditioning further with more grass feeding, dehorning, deworming, and vaccination. Feedlots, or feed yards, are typically massive operations where up to 100,000 head of cattle are monitored for health and fed on high-energy diets of grains, such as corn, oats, barley, sorghum, and hay. This is to get them up to their target weight, faster, on less land, with less labor. Some antibiotics are administered for prevention of disease, some for the cure of infections, and some antibiotics, none related to drugs used by humans, are used to increase yield by promoting certain bacterial colonies in the rumen of the cattle that allow the cattle to grow with less grain. Administration of these drugs is overseen by the FDA, the USDA, and follows the Beef Quality Assurance Program, which documents the best practices for minimal and proper use of antibiotics in the production of beef products. Once a head of cattle reaches target weight, which, on average, is 1,200 pounds, it is sent to processing facilities to be dispatched, often with a compressed air stunner that drives a steel bolt through their skull. It's that weapon Javier Bardem's character uses in the 2007 movie No Country for Old Men.
Hold still, please, sir.
The cattle is then slaughtered, and in the case of ground beef, the meat is fed into giant grinders which can grind over 800,000 pounds of meat a day. In other words, the ground beef in your hamburger isn't from one cow, but maybe from thousands of cows. If what you are eating is marketed as ground beef, that's the end of the process. To be labeled as ground beef, the beef product cannot contain any additives, phosphates, binders, extenders, water, or organ meat. It's just ground beef. But if it's called something like beef patties or hamburger patties, a whole bunch of things might be in there, such as the mysterious additives, which may include things like potassium sorbate, hydrogenated cottonseed oil, corn fiber, cornstarch, sugar, and various flavorings and seasonings. Speaking of which, some places like A&W, for example, have been known to include appetite-increasing MSG derivatives in those seasonings, along with flavor enhancers like disodium inosate, disodium guanylate, and silicon dioxide. Silicon dioxide. You may be interested to know that even the toppings on fast food burgers can have additives. For instance, the pickles on burgers from McDonald's, White Castle, and Jack in the Box contain potassium sorbate, a food preservative. They also have food dyes that may trigger allergies in some individuals. And as we all know, sauces, which often appear on fast food burgers, can hide all sorts of things. McDonald's Big Mac sauce, for example, contains our preservative pale potassium sorbate. Between the burger, toppings, and sauce, your meal may be sponsored by potassium sorbate. For most of the history of fast food, the meat you would find in most fast food hamburgers was processed meat, meaning the ground beef had been modified to improve its taste and shelf life. So what's so bad about processed meat? Well, for one thing, processed meats have been linked to cancer. In fact, the World Health Organization has, in their own words, confidently concluded that processed meat causes cancer, although they don't say how much you have to eat to be at risk. And if cancer doesn't scare you off, processed meat has also been linked to conditions like heart disease, high blood pressure, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. To make matters worse, a number of fast food places used to claim their burger patties were made from 100% beef, when they were actually using processed meat. McDonald's, for example, used to make their burgers with a byproduct known as finely textured beef, which is made from ground-up beef trimmings treated with ammonium hydroxide, a chemical that kills bacteria. Infamously known as the pink slime, McDonald's stopped using it in 2011, but not so much because they wanted to. Despite all the pink slime, there have always been fast food places that make their burgers with real beef. While McDonald's was writing it out with the pink slime, In-N-Out has been using real beef since 1948, Whataburger since 1950, and Wendy's since 1969. So what finally changed Ronald McDonald's mind? Well, in the early aughts, there was an explosion in the popularity of fast casual-style burger places like Shake Shack and Five Guys that all used real beef. Consumers started taking note of things like that, and the competition started to eat into Ronald's bottom line. After McDonald's finally ditched the pink slime in 2011, their burgers have been made from 100% beef ever since. They've also eliminated any preservatives, artificial flavors, and colors. Other franchises that now use 100% real beef include Burger King, Sonic, A&W, and Fatburger. But not everyone has got on board. Jack in the Box, for example, still uses processed beef, which is a Jack in the Box thing to do. Of course, making all that real beef has its own impacts. Large-scale cattle farming contributes to greenhouse gas production. Cattle ranches use a lot of land, some of which involve deforestation in some parts of the world. And the soybeans used in cattle feed is a water-intensive crop causing cows to belch methane. In fact, according to some calculations, as recently as 2019, McDonald's produced over 50 million metric tons of greenhouse gas in its beef production process. In 2014, the Golden Arches vowed to reach net zero carbon by 2050, and by some accounts, it has been a leader in moving towards beef sustainability. And considering McDonald's sells around 2.5 billion burgers a year, addressing the problem is going to take an industry-wide effort. But at least there's no more pink slime in our Quarter Pounders. Believe it or not, these days, most of your favorite fast food burgers are made from 100% real beef. Unless you happen to be a fan of Jack in the Box, in which case you're already immune to bad news. Today, McDonald's Big Mac is made from real beef, as is Burger King's Whopper, Wendy's Baconator, In-N-Out's Double Double, Shake Shack's Shack Burger, Fatburger's Original Burger, Carl's Jr.'s Famous Star, and Five Guys' creatively named Hamburger. So if eating processed beef is one of your concerns, feel free to get that fast food hamburger and dig right in. McDonald's announced in 2018 that it would start working to reduce the use of antibiotics in its beef. And they have lessened its use, although their beef production process still uses some, as does Wendy's, although neither as much as Burger King, Sonic, Jack in the Box, and Dairy Queen. Animal cruelty concerns are another issue fast food companies face. Factory farming typically entails keeping animals in cramped, stifling conditions. In 2012, McDonald's announced they would change some of those practices as they relate to pigs. But according to the Humane Society of the United States, they haven't changed much yet. Even billionaire investor Carl Icahn has slammed the company for its treatment of animals and has made efforts to force them to overhaul their practices. The bottom line is that while there's still a lot to improve in the fast food meat pipeline, the burgers you get at a fast food joint these days are, for the most part, 100% real beef. Just don't ask what's in the chicken nuggets. Did you ever wonder why there's a barf-flavored Jelly Belly? Or booger-flavored? Or earwax-flavored? Or, hope you aren't eating during this. Counterintuitive as it may seem, the iconic Jelly Bean brand, Jelly Belly, is just giving the people what they want. It just so happens that what the people want is pretty gross. So, today, we're puckering up for the sweet to sour history of Jelly Belly. Okay, time for a story about some magic beans. In 1869, Gustav Görlitz started a confectionery company in Belleville, Illinois, which he imaginatively called the Gustav Görlitz Confectionery Company. Things took off for Görlitz, but he was wiped out by the economic panic of 1893 and had to sell the business to cover his debts. He died in 1901 at the age of 55, and his son Adolf restarted the business once the candy market came back. That restarted business finally hit its stride when it started producing mellow creme candies, primarily made from corn syrup, honey, carnauba wax, chocolate, and sugar. You're probably most familiar with them in the form that became a big success for Görlitz, candy corn. The highly successful endeavor soon had factories in Cincinnati and Chicago. Inspired by the success Adolf was having, Gustav's other son, Hermann, headed to Oakland, California, and in 1922, he founded the Hermann Görlitz Candy Company. Now, starting a competing business sounds like a crappy thing to do to your brother, but in those days, the candy industry was regional, so they weren't really in competition at all. No Succession-esque rivalries here. Fast forward to 1959, and Herman's grandson, Herman Rowland Sr., took over his granddad's company, adding a few new products to his line, including jelly beans. Then, in 1965, he started making a new type of miniature jelly bean that had a flavored shell and center. Both were unusual for the time, and they made for an exceptionally tasty treat. In 1976, candy and nut distributor David Klein stood on the shoulders of jelly bean giants and developed a new version of the Gurlitz Mini Jelly Bean using natural flavors. Klein partnered up with Gurlitz to mass-produce his creation, which he named Jelly Belly, in honor of blues musician Huddy William Ledbetter, famously known as Leadbelly. The first 8 flavors were cream soda, grape, green apple, lemon, licorice, root beer, tangerine, and very cherry. Klein began by selling them out of Fosselman's Ice Cream Parlor in Alhambra, California. After a successful publicity stunt in which he hired people to wait in line to buy Jelly Bellies and tipped off the press, he became famous alongside his beans, even appearing on late-night shows as Mr. Jelly Belly. Being Mr. Jelly Belly does sound like a lot of fun, but what sounds like more fun is being rich beyond your wildest dreams. To that end, Klein sold his interest in Jelly Belly to the Gurlitz Company in 1980 for about $5 million, around $18 million in 2024, and that's pretty sweet. Once Klein was gone, the company introduced their own Mr. Jelly Belly, an anthropomorphized jelly bean, wearing nothing but shoes, gloves, and a chef's hat. So, wait, does that mean he's cooking his friends? What are the rules here, Mr. Jelly Belly? Before he was president of the United States, Ronald Reagan was governor of California. Before he was governor of California, Ronald Reagan smoked pipes. But he decided he needed to nix the habit. That's where the jelly beans come in. Rowland heard about Reagan's struggle with tobacco and had some mini jelly beans sent over to the future 40th president. The result was that right around 1966, Reagan got over his tobacco addiction and became addicted to mini jelly beans instead. By 1973, he was writing the manufacturer letters to personally tell them that it's gotten to the point where we can hardly start a meeting or make a decision without passing around a jar of jelly beans. We owe you a special measure of thanks for helping keep our state government running smoothly. Ronald Reagan's addiction to jelly beans was one the former movie star would take with him all the way to the presidency. And if you guessed Reagan's endorsement was good for business, you guessed right. According to the New York Times, in 1980, just 1 year after the public found out that Reagan was hooked on the stuff, Jelly Belly became a global name, and sales doubled from $8 to $16 million a year. Once he secured the White House, Reagan had, we kid you not, 7,000 pounds of jelly beans shipped in for his 1981 inauguration. They were produced as a gift from Rowland, who even had a special blueberry flavor manufactured so the beans could be red, white, and blue. By the end of Reagan's presidency, Jelly Belly had shipped the man an astounding 3.5 tons of their product. Hopefully not all at once. 2001 was a great movie, and a great year for Jelly Belly. It was the year that the two Gurlitz candy companies finally merged into one, the Jelly Belly Candy Company. At the time, the company was careful to clarify that they'd still be making candy corn and the roughly 100 or so other candies they were currently selling. Nonetheless, not everyone was happy about the change. The Gurlitz name had survived for over 100 years, and tossing it struck some as disrespectful. But Jelly Bellies constituted so much of the company's overall business that they felt a name change was due, and it was easy to see why. By 2008, a full 85% of their sales were Jelly Bellies. Speaking of disrespect, in 2022, David Klein, the guy who actually invented Jelly Bellies, sued the company in federal court. He claimed the Jelly Belly people were trying to rewrite the history and origin of the Jelly Belly jelly bean by portraying him as, and this is a direct legal quote, fake. Jelly Belly countersued Klein for falsely calling himself the founder of the Jelly Belly Candy Company, which, as you recall, was created from the companies founded by the Gurlitz family. Jelly Belly further argued that Klein was using this misleading claim to bolster a CBD jelly bean business he was starting. As of 2024, the suits have yet to be resolved. Bet you never guessed the jelly bean business was so dramatic. For those of you unfamiliar with the Harry Potter universe, Bertie Bott is a wizard confectioner who accidentally created a line of candies called Every Flavor Beans. True to their name, the beans come in literally every flavor imaginable, from the delightful to the disgusting. Hogwarts headmaster Albus Dumbledore even mentions eating one that tasted like vomit. A consumer never knows what they're going to get, and the risk you might end up eating a bad-tasting one is part of the fun, allegedly. Thanks to the magic of marketing tie-ins, Bertie Bott's every flavor beans are available to us out here in the real Muggle world. They're made by Jelly Belly, and they come in a variety of flavors wide enough to make the fictional wizard proud. Yes, there are the standards like banana, lemon, and blueberry, but there's also stuff like earthworm, earwax, and black pepper. So just like in the book, there's a risk with every mouthful. Speaking of which, if you had to turn jelly beans into a torture device, how would you do it? While you're thinking, allow us to explain Bean Boozled, a line of Jelly Bellies specifically designed to activate your PTSD. You see, Bean Boozled packages jelly beans in identical-looking pairs. One is a delicious flavor, the other is a flavor that you'll regret. For example, will that dark brown bean taste like chocolate pudding or dog food? There's only one way to know for sure. The first edition came out in 2007, and a typical set comes with 10 pairs. The 6th edition, for example, came with pairs like pomegranate and old bandage, peach and barf, and strawberry banana and dead fish. Hey, Sean Evans, once Hot Ones is over, we've got a new show for you. The packages are sold with a spinner that turns it into a game. And there's even an app where people can play remotely. And when that whole 2020 quarantine thing hit, people got desperate for entertainment, and the Bean Boozled challenge really took off. Given the existence of Bertie Bott beans and Bean Boozled, you're probably wondering how the people at Jelly Belly know what boogers and vomit taste like. Well, kids, get ready to hear about the worst job in the world. Nah, just kidding. No one actually has to taste that stuff. So how do they do it? Through the power of smell-o-vision. Seriously? Kind of. The first step is to use a fancy whatchamajigum called a gas chromatograph. It vaporizes the substance in question and analyzes the vapors, converting them from scents into flavor markers. For example, when they wanted to make a stinky socks flavor, they threw some dude's actual stinky socks into the thingamabob, and it spit out a starting point for a formula. Once a jelly bean is made, it's taste tested by executives, then tweaked based on feedback. If you have a hard time imagining some executive saying, "This doesn't taste enough like fart," then know that Herman Rowland himself set the rotten eggs flavor back because he had once tasted rotten eggs and didn't think the bean was bad enough. Of course, not everything is quite so calculated. The barf-flavored bean, for example, was originally intended to taste like pizza. The problem was that everyone thought the cheese flavor tasted like, barf. Rather than waste more money trying to get it right, they decided to go with a good bad thing when they saw it. Today, Jelly Belly is a global corporation with distribution in 80 countries. At the same time, it's still a family business run by Lisa Rowland Brasher, the great-great-granddaughter of founder Gustav Görlitz. It makes over 100 different flavors of jelly bean, the most popular variety of which has been Very Cherry since 2003. And it manufactures an eye-popping 1,680 jelly beans per second. That's enough so that a single day's product weighs as much as 24 elephants, and they sell an estimated 15 billion of them a year. And conservatively, we'd guess around 10 billion of them are sold to the Ronald Reagan estate. It wasn't always this way with Velveeta. At one point in history, before you, your parents, and possibly even your grandparents were alive, Velveeta was good and pure gold. Europeans, who practically invented and perfected cheese, had the soft American cheese imported. Then, Velveeta was sold, and everything went to hell. Today on Weird History Food, we're gonna talk about the gooey, creamy, messy history of Velveeta. And now, let's get cheesy, or as close as we can get without actually containing cheese. Let's start the Velveeta story at the very beginning with Emil Fry, a young cheesemaker who was given the seemingly impossible task of reinventing the cheese wheel and revolutionizing snack culture in the process. Born in Switzerland in 1867, Fry moved to New York with his family when he was a teenager. Because his father was a dairy farmer with a side hustle as a local small-batch cheesemaker, Fry spent his formative years immersed in Casey culture. That's the fancy cheesemonger's name for the craft of making cheese. In 1887, Fry turned 20, and he landed his first professional cheesemaking gig at Neuswander's Cheese Factory in Blooming Grove, New York. Fry was only employed there for a year before he left and began working for the Monroe Cheese Company in Monroe, New York. By the time Fry began working for Monroe Cheese, the company had recently been purchased by business partners Adolphe Toad and Ferdinand Wolf for a cool $25,000. That was some good cheddar back in the day. Not long after Toad and Wolf bought the factory, they opened a second cheese factory in Covington, Pennsylvania, about 212 miles away. While Fry stayed behind in Monroe making dozens of different niche cheeses, the Covington factory specialized in big Swiss wheels. With the two factories running at full steam, Toad and Wolf started receiving more cheese orders than ever before, and the business was gaining traction. Only there was one problem. Every time a delivery truck left the Covington factory filled with Swiss, it would return with chunks of damaged cheese wheels that broke apart while en route to their customers. Nobody wants broken cheese, and it was a problem for the owners of the Monroe Cheese Company. But it was a temporary problem with a world-changing solution. Thanks to poorly paved roads and delivery vehicles with terrible suspensions, Velveeta was invented. Toad and Wolf were smart businessmen, and it didn't take them that long to realize that all those unusable pieces of broken Swiss that accumulated after each delivery were adding up. So they went to Monroe's best cheese man, Fry. The two men explained to Fry that the company was losing hundreds of pounds of cheese a week and tasked him with finding a solution. Several years earlier, Fry invented Liederkranz for the Monroe Cheese Company when Toad asked him if he could make a cheese as close as possible in flavor to Bismarck cheese. Toad used to have Bismarck imported from Europe, but it always went bad before it got to him. Not long after Toad's request, Fry invented a Bismarck knockoff and called it Liederkranz. Only this new Liederkranz was better than the legit Bismarck. The Monroe Cheese Company was getting orders for Fry's new invention from both coasts and everywhere in between. They even shipped it overseas. Fry was a dairy deity. So when Toad and Wolf asked Fry if he had any ideas about what to do with all those broken cheese wheels, the young master went to work. Fry would spend the next 2 years taking hunks of cheese home with him after work, like a grisly detective lugging home gritty case files. During those years, Fry would work weekdays at the Monroe plant only to spend his evenings and weekends over a hot stove at home, mixing the broken Covington Swiss cheese wheels together with different combinations of other various cheese pieces and cheese byproducts such as whey. Finally, in 1918, after hundreds of nights filled with trial and error, eureka! Fry did it. Thanks to the recent scientific experiments by Fritz Settler and Walter Gerber, two researchers who were also conducting their own cheese hybrid experiments in Switzerland, Fry gleaned just enough from his fellow countrymen to keep his cheesy concoction from separating when melted. The magic ingredient? Sodium citrate. Now, when cured, the liquidy goo formed a soft yet firm cheese that could be molded into any shape or size. When asked what he was going to call his Frankenstein monster of a cheese, Fry said he wanted a made-up name that conjured up visions of a smooth, creamy cheese with a velvety consistency. So he called his invention Velveeta. Velveeta cheese was an instant hit and everyone wanted a piece. By the mid-1920s, Monroe was shipping Fry's invention to almost every restaurant and hotel in America, and even several European countries. Yeah, even snooty Europeans couldn't eat enough of this stuff. Germans were so into Fry's cheese that a Velveeta processing plant had to be built in Deutschland to satisfy their Jones for the creamy, velvety concoction. Even then, the German Velveeta factory couldn't keep up with the demand. But the cheese wheel in the sky took a turn for the worse in 1927. After riding that golden wave of Velveeta for 9 years, the Monroe Cheese Factory sold the product to Kraft Foods, and everything changed, even the recipe. A brick of Fry's Velveeta was pure cheese with no chemicals. But when Kraft bought the brand, drastic changes were immediately made. And while an official reason wasn't given, it almost surely had to do with profit margins. Because Kraft knew that staying faithful to Fry's original all-cheese Velveeta recipe would cost them a lot of money and labor, the company decided to swap out all of the cheese in Fry's Velveeta for fillers. Lots and lots of fillers. While most cheeses then and now consist of milk, rennet, a started culture, and a bit of salt, Kraft Foods added the following ingredients to the new version of their latest acquisition. Okay, deep breath. Water, modified food starch, canola oil, gelatin, paprika extract, lactic acid, sorbic acid, which acts as a preservative, sodium alginate, enzymes, apocarotenol, milk protein concentrate, milk fat, calcium phosphate, annatto, which gives today's Velveeta you eat its rich golden hue, whey protein concentrate, vitamin A palmitate, sodium phosphate, and natural flavor. No plastic, though. The microscopic traces of plastic in the new Velveeta urban legend is about as true as spider eggs in bubble yum, or that if you eat Pop Rocks with your soda, your stomach will explode. Besides screwing with the original recipe, Kraft also completely remarketed the Velveeta brand. Before the Monroe Cheese Company sold it, Velveeta was mostly consumed as an accoutrement for a much larger family meal. The cheese's first generation of fans bought the inexpensive product to give flavor to boring staple foods like soups, sandwiches, and of course, pasta. And the shell shape really does taste better because it has convenient Velveeta collecting pockets pre-installed. Kraft took the opposite approach. They presented their new Velveeta as a health food. Velveeta may be many wonderful things, but health food? Negatory. The corporation convinced everyone that their Velveeta was a nutritious man-made superfood, chock full of carbohydrates to give you energy and fortified with minerals to make you strong. The company even paid for a study conducted by a Rutgers University research team to confirm what Kraft had been saying since it bought the brand. Velveeta is good and good for you. Kraft's marketing people were so convincing that they even duped the American Medical Association in 1931 to proclaim that Velveeta was classified as a health food that contained everything needed to develop, and I quote, firm flesh. Things are a lot different for Velveeta these days. This ain't your daddy's cheese product, at least from a pop culture standpoint. Gone are Kraft's ginned-up declarations that Velveeta is going to keep you healthy and strong with taut, rigid skin. Instead, the new Kraft marketing team has decided to have fun with the brand in an attempt to reframe the public's perception of the old American classic your grandparents used to ration during WW2 and give the product some relevance. For example, in June of 2022, Kraft released a limited edition Velveeta nail polish. The campaign consisted of two shades, a deep yellow called La Dolce Velveeta and a bright red one called Finger Food. Both colors smelled of cheese. That's not a good fragrance for fingers. Also in 2022, the kids in the Kraft marketing department were behind this Central Park public art installation. Kraft's 8-foot novelty box of Velveeta was inspired by German artist Niklas Costello's 400-pound pure gold cube, which was worth $11.7 million and probably just as edible. Hours after Costello removed his installation from the New York City park, Kraft's people swooped in and installed a work of art of their own, an 8-foot box of the liquid gold. And then there was the Cheesepocalypse incident. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the Great Cheesepocalypse of 2014. On January 9th, just before Super Bowl XLVIII, the one where Bruno Mars and the Red Hot Chili Peppers performed during halftime, the Kraft marketing team took to Facebook and nearly started a cataclysmic riot. Kraft confirmed that the rumor making the rounds was true. The U.S. was low in stock on Velveeta, and with only about a month to go before the Super Bowl, the season when households across America would be scooping up Velveeta to make game day dips, Americans lost their goddamn minds. Suddenly, Velveeta was being sold on the black market. Almost too quickly, Kraft launched a fully functioning website that tracked all Velveeta shortages and deliveries around America, sort of like the Santa tracker for blocks of nacho lubricant. Kraft then coined Velveeta's new nickname when they posted a Facebook message stating that they were working on ensuring every American would be able to drench their Super Bowl foodstuffs with our nation's most precious commodity, liquid gold. Whether or not Cheesepocalypse was a genuine shortage or a manufactured scare didn't matter. Fans of the cheese-like substance rallied around Velveeta and their depleted resources, thrusting the old staple back into the headlines, 96 years after ML Fry invented its original formula. But Cheesepocalypse doesn't even compare to the briny swill that Kraft came up with in July of 2022. Riding high from several successful marketing campaigns earlier in the year, Team Kraft created the Veltini, a Velveeta-infused vodka martini. Sold only between the golden hours between 5 p.m. and 8 p.m. at select restaurants, the Veltini was brutally panned. They should have sold it between the hours of 2 and 4 a.m. because that's clearly when it was invented. Who'd have thought that vodka, olive brine, Velveeta stuffed olives, and pasta shells would taste so peculiar? Although it's taken its share of bad raps like the Veltini, Velveeta has endured for over a century and isn't going anywhere. For every fine cheese enthusiast who clucks their tongue at the mere sight of that mysterious golden goo, there are tens of thousands of people who don't care that their favorite cheese isn't really cheese. But who cares what those cheese snobs think anyway? As long as tortilla chips exist in this crazy world, there will always be a place for Velveeta.